Good afternoon. Today is Saturday, September 29th, 2012. We are in the home of Lee Bomar in Tucson, Arizona to hear about his military service. My name is Ethan Oglesby, here with Don Dickinson, the advisor of the Veterans Heritage Project. So Mr. Bomar, could you tell us about your military service from the time you came out of ROTC with any background information that encouraged you to join the service?
Okay, I went to a military school, and of course they had ROTC. It was not one of the academies, but an ROTC school at that time, all male at the time. And everybody had to be in ROTC, whether they were going to go into the service or not at the end of their time, except the veterans who had come back from World War II, and they were not required to take ROTC unless they wanted to. So I served my years there in ROTC and was fortunate enough to be a distinguished military graduate, which only a few of us got out of the Corps every year.
What does that mean, distinguished?
Which means that if you wanted, well, it was just because of academics as well as your ROTC experience. They just thought it was above average, if you want to look at it that way. And so I accepted that because I really didn't know what I wanted to do, although I liked ROTC and I thought I would like the military, so I accepted the regular Army commission. And about 2 months after that, I got my orders to Fort Knox, Kentucky, because I had chose armor as my 2-year combat arms assignment, which you had to do as regular Army officers at that point. So I signed my papers on the 29th of February, believe it or not. It was a leap year, and I did that purposely, for whatever reason it might be worth. And so I was on active duty as of the 29th of February 1952, but they did not call me up for a couple of weeks, and then I reported to Fort Knox and served there in a unit that was training people to become officers, reserve officers unit, if you will. They were mostly enlisted men who wanted to become officers, and so I served there for almost a year until I got my orders to Korea in early 1952, and I ended up in Korea in February of 1952. And was assigned up to the front line area as a platoon leader in A Company, 140th Tank Battalion, 40th Infantry Division. Now, at that time, the war was still going on pretty heavily, but not running up and down the peninsula like they were at one time. So we were more or less stationary, and my platoon, as well as the other platoons in the company, were up on the front line, so to speak, on hills overlooking the enemy and making sure that they weren't going to overrun us, aware of everything that was going on. We actually fired at them a good bit if we thought we had a target out there in our tanks. These were patent tanks, but strangely enough. No.
Sherman tanks? Were they Sherman tanks?
They were patent tanks, M40s, I believe they called them at that time. The Sherman tanks were still in the service at that time, but we happened to have the patent tanks, the M40s, I think it was called.
Those considered better?
Well, they were a heavier tank, more armor, bigger. They had the 105, the 90 millimeter gun, and I think the Shermans probably had 76 or something like that. But anyhow, so we were up on the front line, and we never had a real conflict during that period of time until I was called out to meet our new company commander, as I mentioned a minute ago, who happened to be George S. Patton IV, old blood and guns son. He was a captain at the time. I was a second lieutenant, and met him, and he was really a swell guy. he had a lot of things to live up to.
Right.
He did his best and did a good job of it, and he was well liked by everybody in the company. So this went on, and we stayed up on the line there for quite a while. And then about June of 1952, we had left the front line and gone back to rest, if you will. We'd been up there a long time, our company had, and our platoons. And as we were back in the training area, if you want to call it that, the Chinese had entered the war at that time, for some time before actually. Actually, when we were up on the line originally, we were facing the Chinese. We were supporting the 12th Rock Division. We were not supporting our own troops with our tanks. We were supporting the Koreans, trying to get them trained and battle-worthy and so forth. So, being back in the training area, there was a battle up around Luke's Castle, Bong Son, I think it was Baldy, up in that area, in a similar area where we had been, but a little removed from it. And the Chinese were, I guess this was probably the last big battle of the war. It was in June, and the war ended in July, so, or early August, I forget which it was. But they were giving us a fit up there in the rock divisions and the tankers that were supporting them, our tankers. But A Company was not on the front line when this all started. And so all of a sudden we were called that they needed us very badly, our company, back up on the front, because B Company, I think, had been overrun some, and they were just had been weary of fighting. This was a long-term battle. So 56 miles is where we were from where we ended up to relieve the other company that was online during this battle. And they got there in one day and relieved them that night. And we were immediately attacked again, because the attack hadn't stopped. And we were somewhat overrun. The Rock Division who were ahead of us that we were supporting was pretty much overrun. And so it was quite a battle. Fortunately, that we repelled them and held our own. Some of our tanks were overrun, and they had to abandon a few of our tanks. But there was only one tank out of our company that was overrun and had a casualty. We lost only one man in the whole battle, and he was in the tank down in the bog position, if you know what that is, down in the right bottom side of the tank, where they have a machine gun position down there, as well as the other armor on the tank. And somehow, when we had to, I was not there at that time, but that tank was overrun and destroyed. Somehow or another, he did not get out. I don't know if he was overcome or not, but the tank, of course, was set on fire, and the 70 or 80 caliber 90 ammunition there that they shot all exploded inside the tank, and he was demolished. They never found anything but about a teacup full of his ashes and so forth after the battle was over. So we only lost one man the whole time that I was in that company, as far as battles were concerned. And so after that, we moved to another position, the punch bowl position, which was near where we were, and were stationed there until the armistice came. And as I said, gosh, I can't remember whether it was July or August, but it's in the history books someplace. And so immediately Captain Patton, of course, he didn't want any more of that company. The battles were over. He wanted to go to the headquarters. division headquarters. He actually went to the, I think it was the 4th Infantry Division, or 40th, or maybe to a higher headquarters, and got himself a job. And I had made first lieutenant by then, back in April, I think it was, of that year. And somehow or another, he talked the people back there in the headquarters to give me the company for the rest of the time I was going to be there as a first lieutenant. And there was another captain that was in line for it too, and somehow he convinced them to give it to me, because being regular Army, and he liked me, and even though I had not made up my mind to be whether I was going to be an armor or not, I got the company, and so I had A Company of the 140th Tank Battalion for the rest of the time I was in Korea, which was about 3 months. And back in those days, you got so many points. If you were on the front line, you got so many points rotation-wise. And when you got 40 points, if you were on the front line for 10 months and got 40 points, you were eligible for rotation out and let somebody else take your place. So I had my 40 points and rotated out in October of 1952. So that was my career in armor. I had my 2 years, almost 2 years in by that time, a little bit short, but they let me go anyhow out of armor, and I was transferred to quartermaster and went to Fort Lee, Virginia, which is the quartermaster headquarters and still is as far as I know. And I went to officers' school there to learn about the quartermaster corps. And when that was over, just about the time I was going to be reassigned someplace, all of us were that were in that particular school, officer school. I was interviewed one day and asked if I would be interested in going to either MIT or Georgia Tech and get my master's degree in textile engineering.
Ooh.
And that was quite an honor. Only a few of us got that, as well as some other types of master's degrees other than, so I chose Georgia Tech, being from the South anyhow. And so I was sent to Georgia Tech in January, after I had taken some leave and so forth, and enrolled, and happened to have some old schoolmates there who had been in the service and were working, some of them at Lockheed and some other places in Atlanta, and was able to room with one of them. I was still single at the time. And so I started my master's degree there in early 1954, and wore civilian clothes, except I was attached to the 3rd military district in the U.S., which was at Fort McPherson in Atlanta. And 2 days, this is kind of beside the point, but 2 days after I was there and joined these people that I had known at Clemson, one of them said, "Hey, I want to take you down and meet you some people from Spartanburg," which was close to where I grew up, and fairly close to Clemson, Spartanburg, South Carolina. Happened to be 2 girls that had just finished Converse College, which is an all-girls school in Spartanburg, and were down there teaching in the school for the deaf, junior league school for the deaf, because they had been graduates of deaf course at Converse. And that's where I met Joe. I won't go into that because we found out later we had played football against each other somewhere in Greenville and didn't know it. But anyhow, so I married during the time I was in. That's neither here nor there for a military career. But when I finished Georgia Tech, and what they wanted out of me to begin with, I think, I was sent to Philadelphia to the Defense Clothing and Textile Supply Agency in Philadelphia. where we had a depot there, and where I became a procurement officer, which ended up being my MOS, if you will, procurement officer in Quartermaster Corps, which is same as purchasing, they call it procurement. And ended up 1 year as a procurement officer buying all of the clothing and textile agencies, which was competitive at that time and still is. You have to make bids for it, industry does. Awarding contracts to people who would make our clothing and all types of military clothing and equipment, by the way, too, which would be backpacks and food boots and all this sort of thing. So I served as procurement officer for a year at the Defense Textile and Supply Agency. And then, as they wished, I went to R&D, research and development, for a year, learning all about the research and development that goes on in that type of career. And then ended up in the third part of what was there, which was the requirements and distribution. In other words, thinking how much we needed to buy. I was in my assignment unit there, and I think just for fun, one of the officers who was overlooking my career said, "How would you like to go to Australia?" On a 3-year assignment. And I said, "Australia? What do we have in Australia?" And so he told me what this was. Actually, Australia at that time only had 13 million people in the whole country. This was 1970 now, when I was ready to go over there. And most of the people, even today, are around the perimeter. You know, Australia is a very dry continent and hot, and not much rainfall, so the interior is very barren. But anyhow, some years before, and I think it was, who was our president then?
Nixon?
No, before Nixon. Anyhow, who was the president that when I was getting assigned to Australia? It had been over there and made a deal with the Australians about 3 years before. See, Australia didn't have any military industry at all. They had very little industry, period, except mining and geology and that type of thing. So all their military equipment had to come from somebody else, and they were buying military equipment from us by the millions and millions of dollars. And so they cornered this president, and I'll think of his name eventually, because it was about four years before I got there. And he said, "Okay, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll give you a chance to sell some stuff to us." And Vietnam was going on at that time. He said, "I'll set up an office over here and go around to your industry people and your military people and show them what our industry has to do to compete for contracts. And if you can be successful, competitive-wise, we'll let you supply some things to us, and this will set up the balance of trade a little bit." So I was the second officer to go over there in that position. And so...
Wasn't Johnson, was it?
May have been
Yeah, I think it
Johnson.
was Johnson, yeah. Yeah.
Must
Yeah.
have been, because that was when I went to sign the condolence book, but she said, "You sound like Lady Bird."
Yeah, okay, so it was Johnson that had made the deal with them. And so one officer had gone over 3 years before I got there and was doing this. He was going out to all Australian industry people and teaching them about our procurement regulations, that they would have to compete by the same standards our people were going to compete. And it also included New Zealand. It was called the Department of Defense USDO Department of Defense, USDO Procurement Information Office, Australia, USDO PIO, Australia, A. So it also, although it was just called Australia, we also had responsibilities in New Zealand to do the same thing. So we were able to go to New Zealand anytime we needed to, which I went about 3 or 4 times a year while I was there for about a week or 10 days at a time, doing the same thing in New Zealand, showing those people what they would have to do to compete to sell us things. And so I did that for 3 years. Was able to travel all over Australia and New Zealand at will. And my boss was in Hawaii, and he couldn't even get in touch with me. Most of the time I had to get in touch with him. He'd send me a wire saying, call me, I can't get you. So really, we just had...
He was in a perpetual luau.
We had a very wonderful 3 years, including the Carl C. balls that they have there every year, and that's what this was for mainly. The Carl C. ball, because we saved their
I will have to tell you an interesting thing. Our next door neighbor was an old Australian, and she said, I'll always love you all. And I said, why? And she says, because I remember the night that I prayed all night. Dear God, let the Yanks get here before the Japs. Dear God, let the Yanks get here before the Japs.
They would have been invaded.
Yeah.
If we hadn't had that
Bad
battle, the Carl C. battle. And that's why this Carl C. ball was held every, if it had not been for our Navy in the Carl C. battle sinking a great number of the Japanese ships, they were on their way to Australia.
I see.
If they had ever gotten in, see, Australia's population when we were there was only 13 million.
That's what
And that was back in the years that we were there. And previous to that time, there were many, it was practically unoccupied. If the Japanese had gotten there, they would have just gone right in and taken over.
Yeah.
It was scary.
So anyhow, the young people, of course, Vietnam was going on in Vietnam. The young people didn't like us, but that's understandable.
They never do.
Most people don't,
Yeah, sure.
even today. But the older Australians just could not like us anymore and just would do anything for us. So anyhow, so I was there 3 years doing this. I had a U.S. enlisted sergeant working for me and an Australian secretary, and was with the I was under the Department of Supply, the Australian Department of Supply, which is kind of like the Quartermaster Corps. So when that assignment was over, I had pretty much decided to retire, and then when I found out I was going to be sent to Korea again, and I didn't want to go without the family, I put in my resignation, and so we came back in March or late February of 1973, and I took my leave and was assigned to be retired at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, because that's where I was going to retire back to, and that's where I retired and had my retirement ceremony there, having gone through Hawaii again, of course, with the family too.
Required to spend 2 weeks there.
Yeah, because I had to brief the people on what I had done, and there was and I met my replacement, by the way, before I left. My replacement came in, and strangely enough, about a year or two after that, they decided that they couldn't compete. They never sold us anything while I was there. Right about the time I left, they did.
The Australians.
Yeah, the Australians did sell us some trucks, to left-hand drive trucks, right-hand drive trucks, to send to Cambodia for supplies purposes, and that's the only thing that I ever remember they sold to us. because
will
they,
say
they
that.
couldn't compete.
So where was
everything
everything
was
coming from?
higher in Australia. I thought I was going to Australia and things were going to be cheap, and they weren't because they had to import practically everything,
Yes.
including
Mhm.
clothing, all
Mhm.
kinds of things, you know.
I was gonna put in an interjection there that he didn't tell you about, and that was the fact that I thought he was assigned to Australia. When I got there, I found out I was too. Because that made me attached to the embassy, and therefore made me an embassy wife.
Ah,
And I had to meet all of the social requirements.
all the protocols,
I
sure.
mean, you know, make all the calls, go to all the places, I had to go to all the teas, and I was definitely not a social
Yeah,
butterfly, believe me.
The assistant secretary of
Navy.
the Army for logistics, I think they called him, Secretary,
Shillerton?
who's the guy head of, that was with the computer company,
Oh, yeah.
uh,
It's a long time ago.
anyhow, she had to take care of his wife.
Yes, I mean, you had to do little things, you had to meet the plane, you had to have made hair appointments for them so they could.
Really?
Oh, yeah, they had to have hair appointments. You had to have a list of everybody they were gonna meet, and you had to brief them on what these people did, what their hobbies were, and all of this kind. See, I didn't expect that. But I did get to ride around in an embassy car.
Okay.
Had to do
All right.
something. But most of the things we did have to do. I had to belong to the Australian Wives Club. I never missed a meeting. We had to do all sorts of things that I really had not anticipated on. Fortunately, Australia was a fairly safe country so that my children could come home from school, and I left the door unlocked for them
Mhm.
when I had to do all of these things. But I mean, it was just like at other embassies when there were teas and bridge things and all sorts of charity things, I had to put in an appearance. You got an invitation, and when it said invitation, you didn't say no.
You were like a
So
first
it was
lady.
So it was kind of interesting. Well, I mean, we all did. It wasn't just me. But there's
So
what
at
you
any
wanted.
rate, there he is,
With the note on the
with
back.
the notes on the back.
Oh, that's cool.
But it was interesting because I did learn a great deal about people from other countries because we had to deal with
Where I am,
other
right
wives.
there. I was in
And you would be
uniform.
amazed how much
there.
we had in
You see my
common.
name?
Really?
Because they were all kind of caught.
Now, this is me
Same
with
thing
my
that you
back,
have to
but
make.
here I am,
Like when a lesser
We'll use that
We
one.
can actually see my
person
Bomar
came in,
there.
low on the rank. His wife had to go, like I had to have people that came to, when there was a newcomer to the diplomatic circle, anywhere. They made calls on me and they came with their little white gloves and I served tea. And then there were those that liked to have sherry instead, but other
We'll
than
get that one.
that, it was a very interesting kind of thing as a military wife.
You probably don't want any more of this ad-libbing stuff, but I was
Yes,
going,
that's it.
I was going to tell you, and this is after my career, I was going to tell you about the Thai colonel that I became friends with
Mhm.
in my property disposal class at Fort Lee. And so when I went on R&R while I was in Vietnam, I called him, and actually he was still in service at that time. And we met and so forth, but when I took her to Thailand, which I told her was a fascinating country and a lot of history in World War II, and all of what happened there, the bridge over the River Kwai.
Right, yeah.
We called him again, and he had nothing to do but say he was going to take us to a Thai boxing match on him. And we met him, and he took us to the Thai boxing. This is where they kick each other and do all this sort of thing. You've probably seen Thai boxing. So he took us out to dinner and to this Thai boxing match. And I've lost contact. Somebody stole my book that had all of the addresses and things in it while I was in working in Spartanburg. Went to bowling one night and I had my briefcase and I had all of my notes, the book that I had, my addresses, all of the people that I associated with in Vietnam, which by the way, in Vietnam we had nurses there. We had 2 hospitals in Quy Nhon, Vietnam. And our barracks was what had been one of the premier of Vietnam's summer vacation places, and they turned it over to us. And that's where I spent my year, in this place that had been, forget the premier, Chai, whatever his name was, back before the war. And so I had been to Thailand, as I said. Anyhow, this colonel took us to the Thai boxing match, and that's the last I ever saw or heard of him, because I lost this book with his name and the address and everything else, and it's the only place I had it. I lost a lot of other people, because in these 2 hospitals we had nurses from New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, England, and doctors, civilian nurses in these hospitals, and we used to get with them and have dances and these nurses had the top 2 floors of this outfit where the officers were stationed, and I sent Joe a picture of my this building one time, and here on the top 2 floors with panties hanging up and stockings and all this. I said, what are you doing over there? Well, I never got involved with them, but I had a roommate that did. I won't go into that, but it was interesting. And what's her name? Joe, what's the gal that came over there in Vietnam with the USO?
USO, you're talking about Stars and Stripes?
Yeah.
That wrote the book, can't remember what her name is.
She
Sorry
came
about
over
that.
there, and I associated with her there, had drinks with her and so
I
forth.
can't remember.
What was her name? She was with the USO at that time.
Was she?
Yeah.
I thought she was the one with the Stars and
But
Stripes.
that was
which is the
interesting
same thing.
experience. And I met an Air Force captain there. He was next door, roommate next door. And we became very good friends. And he was from Idaho. And so we drank beer like it was going out of style over there. The beer sometimes would come in and the beer cartons would be just kind of destroyed and the cans would be bent, and you could go down there and if you wanted to pick up everything it was for free and bring them back, what was supposed to go to the troops, but they didn't send these bent cans to them. So Lee was his name, first name. And so when I got back and we visited, we went to Idaho some years ago. And he died, by the way. I knew he had died, but I got his sister, happened to get in touch with her, and she told me about him. And I had hoped that someday I'd get up to see him, but he died before I got up to see him. But we were very good friends. Lee Lindgren. We were both Lees, and we both hung out together drinking beer just about every night there in this compound where we were when we were both there.
You get told away when you hear about, that's what I said, that somewhere in the bar, because that's where they are, right there. Is in the bar. When they met up, particularly all the celebrities. That's
where they ended up.
Yeah. So,
Ethan, did you have some questions that you wanted to ask?
I was just going to ask what you went on to do after your career in the military.
Well, before I had gone in, even though I knew I was going in the service, but I had about 2 months before they called me up, I got a job with Milliken and Company, which was a textile company, being a textile graduate.
Who was it called?
Milliken, Milliken and Company. It was Darren Milliken at one time. Darren and Milliken went in together and formed a textile company. And so this was a private company and a very successful, and is still a successful company, by the way. and the only one in the U.S. practically that is.
There are not many left.
That's right. And Mr. Milliken was, boy, when the imports started coming in textiles, he blew his stack. He went to Washington. He was a Republican representative from the state of South Carolina on top of that. And he just raised Cain, but he never got anywhere with him. But he had a company, he brought it up from nothing. His grandfather had factored for some southern textile mills during the Depression in the 30s. And that's how he went to Harvard and got his master's and all like that.
Do they know what factoring means? Honey?
Well, selling textiles for the textile companies, but not having any responsibility for not owning them or anything factored for. Well, he decided he'd buy some of these companies when he finished his doctorate and so forth. Mr. Roger Milliken was his name, and he did. And the old textile companies back in those days, textiles, you have to have so much humidity, particularly with cotton textiles, and that's what it was back in the 30s. And the textile mills were just like incubators. The humidity was like 80% or something, and that's what you had to have in there to weave. And the windows open and the guys sweating. Well, he was the first person. He got the idea after he'd had these mills for a while, and they were doing very well, that he would start building his own textile mills. These things were ancient, and the machinery was ancient. And he started buying all the newest textile machinery there was. Anywhere it was made in the world, he didn't care. Water jets, air jets, and just every kind of machinery that had never been heard of in this country. And the Germans and the Japanese started most of this. But he bought all this, and he started building textile plants, and he air conditioned them. There had never been an air conditioner textile plant anywhere in the world. And he did it, and it was successful. And he at one time, he had 60 some odd textile plants, and most of them he had rebuilt himself. He still had some of the old ones, but not the old machinery. He wouldn't put up with that. He air conditioned them, and he was making millions. He was one of the 100 richest men in the U.S., he and his cousin, who they had an office in New York. Well, Roger had his office in Spartanburg, but his cousin ran the office in New York, Garish Milliken. And he made that company. It was private, and it's still private today.
Is it?
Nobody knew what it was, but they estimated, at the time I retired again from Milliken, I worked another almost 20 years. It was estimated that his company was selling $3.5 billion worth of textiles a year. And this was after other textile companies were, Burlington, all of these other companies were struggling, but they had never modernized like he did. They weren't going to spend
So
the
these are
money
still
to do it.
operating in
He put his,
Spartanburg?
oh
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh, yeah.
and they were written
That's
up.
amazing
They were
today's
written up in the
economy.
Wall Street Journal. I've got an article in here about them.
I'm gonna look him up.
They were,
Interesting.
he was written up last year in the Wall Street Journal. He died 2 years ago this December. But his company was written up last year. A friend of mine that I hike with here knew that I had talked about Milliken and Company. And he found this article, I didn't even know it. And it talked about what you can do if you want to in this country, industrial rise. And it is still making money like you wouldn't believe.
Another thing I
Donate to Wofford College there in Spartanburg, Converse, private school she went to, millions of dollars. But it's got to go for a certain purpose or they won't give it to them.
And what did you do there with him?
I had all kinds of jobs. I started out in procurement again,
Of course.
buying textiles. And then I was sent to the research department But I got called back to be in the research division. He was big in the research. And I ended up being the company spy, if you will. I ended up as the competitor intelligence officer for Mulligan and Company.
Really?
And any way I could find out.
Was that your title?
Yeah. Well,
Well, that was the division.
No,
They didn't call him
They
the
didn't call
company
me
spy.
that.
No, no, what I meant was competitor.
I was a,
Competitor intelligence was what it was.
yeah, I was the chief competitor intelligence for Milliken, and went to all the conventions that he had in,
Yeah.
particularly the knit conventions. He had gotten into knitted products and did very well with that about the time I got there in 1973. And he was into everything. He would not get into sheets and towels and that kind of stuff, but he bought Callaway Mills, which is out of LaGrange, Georgia. He did not do anything with the machinery. He had brand new machines that Callaway had that had never been in operation that made towels
Tell them about Visa.
and everything. And he believed in research and development. He had a tremendous research and development department,
That's
hundreds
why
of
he
people.
survived.
And he wanted to know what his competitors were doing with the machinery they were buying, what products they gonna make, did it impact what he was making? That's what I did.
Mhm.
That's what I tried to find
Interesting.
out for him.
Mhm.
And that was before the days you could go to the computer and put in something and Google
Right,
it.
and find that, yeah.
I had to do it the hard way, talking to the machinery people that were willing to talk about people they'd sold machinery to. I got with them. I'd go around to plants that I wanted to find out and talk to people at the bars and so forth to try to find out what they were doing. And it was interesting.
Really
And
interesting.
I never forget, another guy had done that before me, and so I didn't take over this part of it until after I'd been in the research department for a while. And I think the last time I was down at the knitted textile industry convention in Miami at the Doral Country Club. That's where they had it every year.
Been there.
About the time they had the golf tournament down there at the Doral. And the guy come up to me, "Oh, I see you're the company spies here." They knew what we were doing.
You were tagged.
They knew what we were doing, but
What I was
But
gonna
it was
say
an
is you
interesting job.
probably know more about it than
Right.
they may know. But their company began with Visa products. Now, Visa is the finish on a product that makes it no iron.
Yes.
All of those tablecloths
Polyester.
and all sorts of things that you just throw in the washer and then dry and pull right back out and fold it and put it on the table. That's what Milliken did.
Milliken also, in his research department, this is getting way offline, but I don't know if you're interested in all this or not, but he also had people with their doctorate degree in chemical engineering, everything you could think of. And so he got the bright idea one day to build a machine. He had his chemical engineers and people build a machine. And instead of taking textiles and printing things on them and dyeing them and so forth, he got the idea to make a machine that would do this automatically. They would put gray goods, if you will, it had not been dyed, they call it gray goods, through this machine, and it had all kinds of colors in the machine, and that rug right there was made on that machine.
Color injection.
Color injection, instead of printing, or instead of using different kinds of colored yarns to make a design like this. And so he did that, and one of the biggest things he got into at about the same time was the carpet tiles. You remember carpet tiles that are about this square? and you can buy them to carpet. A lot of hotels,
Right.
motels have them. And if you have a cigarette burn on one, you pick it up and because you bought some replacements and put that new carpet tile down and it looks like new. And he made
And that's, and it's very
billions
popular, they have that today, but
off
at
of
the
these,
time, he
these
didn't.
machines. But that's the type of guy he was. And
Also-
he never gave up innovating. And he would not cut his price. All these textile companies that were getting in trouble would cut their price on products. Well, he wasn't selling most of those products anyhow. He was into more things that people wanted quality out of. He sold to the automotive industry, upholstery materials for their cars and things like this. And they would buy from him. They wouldn't buy from the other people. They knew when they got a product from him.
It was quality.
It was quality, it was not gonna fade, it was not gonna die, it was not gonna die, it was not gonna run, this
And
type
what
of
were
thing.
those little triangular boxes that he made for milk and cream?
Anyhow,
But
he
anyway,
was quite a
that's
guy.
neither here nor there.
And,
The other question I asked, did you tell him that you worked with the radiated foods when you were in the Army?
no, when I was with, yeah, you might be interested
At the
in that.
native
When I was in
laboratory.
research and development, the office, OCRD,
In the
they call
Army.
it. And I had that written down, I don't know how I forgot it. Natick Laboratories in Natick, Massachusetts, was into Army stuff, military stuff. And they got the idea, the military, of course, always had a problem with, in wars and things, of sending food over and it spoiling and all this sort of thing. They decided they would put in a radioactive system there at Natick Labs, and they did. They put in a radiation unit underwater, you know how it operates. And they started irradiating meat. Well, they decided to irradiate bacon just to try it because the Army used so much, the military services used so much bacon. And they did. And I ate some of it. I wasn't scared of it. They convinced me that the radiation did not stay in that product. And you can't convince people of that even today, but it doesn't. And they would can it, they would radiate it and can it, open it, and fry it, and serve it. And I ate a lot of it.
Well, you used to bring it on.
When I'd go up there, irradiated bacon. And that was one of the projects that I had in my research and development. They not only, I mean, actually they made clothing and textiles and all this sort of stuff, but somehow somebody in that laboratory up there, and I guess the Army had an idea that it might work too, decided to try irradiating.
And where was this, what exactly, where were you?
Natick Laboratories in Natick, Massachusetts. N-A-T-I-C-K.
During the time.
This was when I was at Fort Lee doing my 3 years.
Okay.
No, Johnny, that was when you were in Washington.
Pentagon, I'm sorry.
You were when you were at the Pentagon.
67 to 70.
Okay.
That's when you were in the Army.
Pretty
Research
soon
Office.
after 70, they gave it up
Mhm.
because they just couldn't convince people.
I think
that-
you ought to tell them the interesting thing, though, that they made them go back, that not only was it just the bacon, well, that's just like you went to the grocery store and bought bacon, they had to buy special pigs that they had raised a certain way, and then they slaughtered them, and then they did bacon, because they had to be perfect for the FDA was selected to know that there was nothing wrong with it before they did it, that it was pure.
I think one of the things that killed the operation, now that I think about it, you bring this up, the FDA never really accepted what they were doing. And they couldn't convince them that there was nothing wrong with it, that the product was a quality product, it was not radioactive, that they just, you know, this was 1967, 8, 9 in there. And a long time before technology what it is today.
They also did some other things, see, they did some vegetables and some fruits that they radiated, and they found out they were fine. It didn't make them mushy or anything like that.
But I'd eat it today. You buy it. Boy, it was good.
That didn't tell too much about your Army career, but it showed you what you were prepared for, right there.
So Nathan, Ethan, excuse me, do you have any other questions you want to ask, or
I
how do you
believe
feel?
that's-
Think we're good?
I think we're good.
All right.
Yeah,
Well,
Molly?
yeah, I'm good. Yeah.
Okay.
I hope I haven't bored you with anything.
Oh,
Not at all.
No.
No.
I, although I wasn't with combat units the whole time, I had some interesting assignments in the Quartermaster Corps.
You sure did.
Uh,
And one of the things that I'm seeing is just how incredibly good the military is at training and developing skills.
They're still doing this. They're
Yeah.
still sending people to
That
get
was
their
another
masters
thing
and
that
even
this doctor
doctorate
did.
if they think it's to their advantage.
You would have to tell him how many of the military service of the officers that Milliken was interested in interviewing them and hiring them because of the training that
Well,
they got.
I had been interviewed before I went in the service. I said 2 months I worked for Milliken. And when I decided to get a job, I was going around to Monsanto and almost got a job there. And then they gave it to somebody else. And then all of a sudden I said, well, heck, I've got a master's degree. I work for Milliken. I better start looking around Milliken. Maybe they've got something. And I went to some of the plants, being in Greenwood, is where we ended up. That's where she's from. And so wasn't getting anywhere. So I said, well, their headquarters is in Spartanburg now. It wasn't at the time that I worked for them. They were still in New York. And so I went to there, and lo and behold, the guy that interviewed me for a job there was the same guy that had hired me 20 some odd years before for 2 months. And he had been hiring military people with certain skills and just thought they were doing a great job for him. He had a transportation corps colonel that was running his warehouse department that was just made all kinds of changes, and he thought the military people really were good people.
Mhm.
And he hired quite a few of them, and he hired me right off the bat at twice the salary that anybody else had offered me at that time, which was not very much. This was 1973. Salaries weren't too great. But I had been interviewed by some textile people that wanted to send me to New York, to be in something up there at a salary that I couldn't even eat. I didn't think.
And most
So,
of them, when they looked at
Milliken-
military people, they said they're getting their retirement, so we don't have to pay them.
Yeah.
I worked harder for Milliken probably other than in combat, than any time I was in the military service. I got called out on the 4th of July one time when the whole family was at our house having a celebration to go to a meeting 30 miles away. I had to go.
When Roger Milliken
I
called,
worked
you go.
That's right.
Saturdays and Sundays for him, just like I had to do in the military quite often. But he paid well. If you did what he wanted and he recognized it, he paid better than any. People who became CEOs of other textile companies had been brought up through the Milliken
It was interesting.
System.